Welcome to the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I'm Melisa Lieberman, a fellow IC and business coach. On this podcast, I teach you to become a consistently booked independent consultant without becoming a pushy salesperson or working 24/7. If I can do it, you can too. Listen on to find out how. Welcome to episode 245 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. This is Melisa Lieberman, and today I'm excited to talk about sustainable lead generation. Sustainable lead generation that works for you specifically as a solo consultant or boutique, small micro consultancy. This is one of the biggest challenges that I hear from consultants is, it's so hard to keep all the balls in the air. And today I want to focus in on how to make lead gen more sustainable. So you'll actually do it and not let it fall by the wayside and then panic when you have a feast or famine cycle. So that's what we're here for. This is really inspired because the lead gen sprint is wrapping up. So as I mentioned to you last week, the lead gen sprint for the fall is almost at the end. It's been so exciting to see all of the results and start getting in the results of the final survey, the end of sprint survey, to see what stands out for people, what they accomplished, what it helped them to really reinforce with what was already working for them, to shift and to make their processes even more impactful, to put new processes in place for lead generation, and ultimately to generate leads and to land clients and to increase pricing. There were so many exciting results from this particular sprint, and I'm excited. I think I told you last week, but we're doing it again in January. So you'll want to join the waitlist for that. I'll tell you in a minute how to do that. But last week we talked on this podcast, episode 244, about how to make your lead gen more predictable. And so today I want to record this episode for you as an extension of that one, which is making it more sustainable. So when you put a lead generation process in place and you start to figure out what your formula is, like if you do this amount of activity and this type of activity, it creates this result in your pipeline, then oftentimes the next hurdle that I hear quickly thereafter is, okay, this is great. I'm starting to see traction here, but how do I keep this up? How do I make this sustainable? And so that's what I want to focus today's episode on. I will tell you there's a tiny bit of overlap from what we talked about last week, but it's just because I want to make sure you have a full and complete episode this week about making lead gen sustainable. So if you hear a tiny bit of repetition from last week, number one, I don't think that's a problem. It's always good to hear things in a slightly different way. And number two, just to reiterate, today we're focused on this, keeping the lead gen process sustainable so that you can keep it up and keep the momentum going and not let it drop off. Whereas last week we focused on that predictability, which means if I put in these inputs, I'll get these outputs, right? So these two episodes go hand in hand. If you haven't yet listened to last week's episode, no problem. Listen to this one, keep going where you're at, and you can go back to that one after you finish this one. All right. So that's what we're here for. And I'm excited to get going here. Okay. First, we're going to talk about the agenda for today. I'll give you the companion resources, and then we'll dive into the first piece of the agenda. So first, we're going to talk about why lead gen isn't sustainable. I think that's really important. Let's set the context here. Why, for so many consultants, lead generation is not a sustainable situation. And therefore, that's why we work on it sometimes and not on others. And then we get a feast or famine, and it's a challenging situation. So why isn't lead generation sustainable? We'll talk about that. Might not be what you're thinking. Then we'll talk about what not to do to make your lead gen process more sustainable, what to avoid. And then we'll talk about I'll share with you 5 approaches you can leverage to make lead generation sustainable for you and your business. And we'll wrap up the episode with the steps to put this episode into action. Okay, the companion resources for today. There are 2 of them. If you haven't yet taken the lead gen effectiveness scorecard, or you haven't taken it recently, I would recommend going over to pipelinescorecard.com and going through that process to answer the questions about your current lead gen strategy, your current lead gen process, your current lead gen mindset, and getting a really good assessment of where your lead gen is strong and you want to keep going with that, and where you have areas of opportunity. So you can find that again at pipelinescorecard.com. We'll put the link in the show notes. And then also, I would recommend, if you have any interest at all in joining the January lead gen sprint, we will start the third week of January, I think, the week of January 19th. And we will work on helping you get into momentum for the first quarter of the year to set yourself up for an amazing 2026. And I would recommend it to you for two scenarios. Number one, if you have no lead gen process to speak of right now, it's very disjointed. I would recommend that you join this sprint because it helps you put that structure into place and install it more quickly than you would be able to on your own, in a way that helps you to avoid mistakes that are commonly made and really get yourself off the ground in a way that's much more repeatable this coming year. And secondarily, if you already have a good lead gen process going, but you're having a challenge making it consistent, making it sustainable, making it quantifiable, getting yourself to the place where you know if that these inputs or activities or actions result in this amount in your pipeline, then I would also recommend that you join the consultant sprint. Right now, it's just a wait list, but get on the wait list so that you can be one of the first to know about the sprint, when it's opening, how you can join, and more details about it. Because when you're in the place where you've already got that ability to generate leads, but you don't have full control over them, and you want more control so that you can hit bigger goals this coming year, this will be a great place for you. So go over to consultantsprint.com, and you can join the wait list there. And then you'll be one of the first to know about the sprint when it comes open, to be able to grab a spot, because there will be limited number of spots. So you want to be one of the first to know about that. Okay, my friends, so good. Those are your companion resources. Now let's dive into the episode and talk about, first and foremost, why lead gen isn't sustainable. For so many consultants, this is one of the challenges that we face as consultants, lead gen, in terms of being able to generate leads. And then when we figure it out, making it sustainable. So what I want to really share with you is that I find that why lead gen isn't sustainable is that a lot of times consultants aren't able to answer the question of what's enough lead gen. And when you don't know what enough lead gen is, then it's so common that then what would happen is that you think, when you don't know what enough is, then you're always thinking that you're not doing enough. And so then from there, of course, when you think something is never enough, you're always falling short in your mind, then you, of course, would delay it or defer it or procrastinate. Of course you would. And so then you start panicking because you then get into a place where your engagement is winding down, or you've got some capacity opening up, or you've got a contract that canceled unexpectedly. Of course, you're going to start panicking. Then from all of that cycle, of course, your lead gen never feels effective or sustainable. And it's not because of your calendar, and it's not because of it's hard to juggle working on your business or working in your business. It's mostly because it's not mentally sustainable, and it's not ultimately financially sustainable, that lead gen. If you're in this cycle where you can't answer what's enough lead gen, you don't have a clear plan, you always think you're not doing enough, you delay and defer, or you think you're not doing it right, and you create this cycle for yourself, and therefore it becomes unsustainable, mentally mostly, and emotionally, energetically unsustainable. And from there, it becomes not financially sustainable, right? Because you aren't generating enough leads, or enough quality leads, or enough leads for the type of work that you want to be doing. And that's not sustainable either. And so this is the reason why lead gen isn't sustainable. You might have been thinking that it's because of your calendar, or because you don't have literally enough time in the day to work on your client delivery and on lead gen. And I will tell you that is not the reason. You can figure out how to juggle these things. There are methods to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about those here in a moment. But in the meantime, what I want to say to you is that it's not because of your calendar or just not enough hours in the day. The reason why your lead gen isn't sustainable is mostly this mental unsustainable process that you've got likely got going on in your head. So that's what we want to tackle today. And we will also tackle a little bit of the time side of this as well. The math of it, if you will. The math of it is important. You need to be able to do whatever your lead gen strategy is in the hours of the day, in the work hours of the week, but also you want it to be mentally sustainable. And that's really the first step of this process. And then the mechanics and the math of it come second. So now let's dive into how can lead gen be sustainable for you, especially when you're juggling this client work, both the math side and the mental side here. And a lot of times when I talk to consultants, they think ultimately the answer is they need to either automate lead generation or outsource lead generation in order to make it sustainable. And I want to say to you that this isn't usually effective. I'm not saying you can't automate parts of it. Of course, there are parts of what you're doing that can be automated. Of course, you could potentially outsource something with leveraging a VA for some pieces of what you're doing. But what I find is that if you're trying to completely get rid of lead generation and give it to someone else, it's usually not effective because this is a relationship business and the lifeblood of your business. So it's not something that you want to set and forget. Now, again, I'm not saying don't automate anything or don't outsource anything because those are certainly experiments that can be really valuable, especially pieces of what you're doing. Once you've figured out what works for you, it's the common scenario of lift and shift, right? When you're outsourcing something, the best way to outsource something is to do it yourself, figure it all out, and then figure out what pieces or parts of it can be outsourced, lift and shift into another organization or another VA or an executive assistant or something like that. So that's why I'm saying to you is that the answer isn't that to make lead gen sustainable, to automate it or outsource it. What I want to share with you today is even more fundamental to that is your ability to make the lead gen process that you've decided or determined for your business to make it more mentally sustainable, number one, to make sure the math works, right? We want to make sure the math works so that it fits into your schedule. That's number two. And number three, that it ultimately yields the expected results. Because if you're doing something and it's not yielding the expected results, then of course it's not going to feel sustainable. You don't want to keep that up when it feels like a waste of your time. So those are the three components of making your lead gen more sustainable, which is number one, it fits into your schedule. Number two, it's mentally sustainable. And number three, it accomplish those three attributes or aspects of a sustainable lead generation process. So number one, let's just go a little bit backwards, making sure that your lead generation process yields the expected results. And these are the results that you define in what I call the lead generation formula. This answers for you what's enough. That's that question that creates so many open cycles in our brain, right? Oh, I'm not doing enough. This won't be enough. This won't work. All of those kinds of thought processes that are so mentally draining. You need to know the answer to that question. What is enough, quote unquote, for you in your pipeline to support your revenue goals? And we talked about this a little bit last week, but as a refresher, you want to establish your hypothesis, right? By reverse engineering your activity based on your goals and your metrics. So knowing your revenue goal and then taking into consideration your things like your close rate and your rate of conversion from leads to prospects means ultimately that you have a hypothesis that X activity equals Y pipeline value. That answers the question of what's enough. Now, of course, you might be saying to me, well, Melissa, I don't know if that's going to be accurate or right. Of course, you don't. None of us do. But you want to be figuring out those numbers, giving yourself a hypothesis, putting it into action, and refining it until you do know that this is enough. Don't cut yourself short by just deciding, well, it's not figure outable from the very outset. You want to guess, give it your best guess, put it into action, and refine it from there. That's what answers what is enough. This was one of the very first steps we did in that lead gen sprint this fall. And it was such an eye opener. And one of the things that I got back was one of the most valuable things that we did in the sprint, especially in the very beginning, was figuring out this exact formula so that there was no guessing. The challenge isn't asking yourself the question of what's enough. The question is, how do I create these numbers? So you move yourself down the process that way, right? Even for the most seasoned consultants that were in the lead gen sprint, this was something that figuring out this particular formula and what's enough that was so valuable from what they told me. Okay, so number one, we're figuring out what's enough. What is the ultimate results that we're looking for so that it feels sustainable for you, where it doesn't feel like you have so many questions in your mind about, am I doing enough? Is this going to be enough? Will this work? All of those questions. Instead, you're calming all of that by creating that formula. That was number one, the technique number one. Technique number two is that you have a lead gen routine. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into this because we talked about it last week. So you can go back and listen to last week's episode, but you want to have a schedule. You want to figure out the math of what is sustainable. You might be fully allocated to client work. That doesn't mean that you just drop the ball on lead generation until you have more time. You're never going to have more time. You want to purposefully manage and ask yourself, how much time do you have in this week for lead generation? The answer should always be something like 2 to 3 hours at a minimum. And so, based on that, what activities fit into that amount of time? And do they match up to your hypothesis, right? That's really the main way to look at this. And so, you want to be looking at your schedule. We've talked about this before, but think about your own business as a client and allocating. You wouldn't just ignore that client because the other ones are keeping you busy. You would focus in on that client and give them the time that they need. And so focusing on it that way, answering for yourself the math of your sustainable lead gen routine. The math of it is what needs to happen on a quarterly basis and when are you going to do that? What needs to happen on a monthly basis? When are you going to do that? Putting it in your calendar, scheduling it. What needs to happen on a weekly basis and a daily basis so that you've got a really clear plan. It might need to ebb and flow a little bit. Doesn't mean that every week is equal or every day is equal, but you want to allocate your resources from your company and yourself to focus on lead generation, not treating this as something that you do in your leftover time. So that is number two. Technique number two to make lead generation more sustainable is that you've got a true schedule where it's allocated on your calendar and you know what you're doing from the formula. And then you're putting that into action in the schedule that you've set aside. Like I said, there was going to be a little bit of overlap from last week, but not a problem. Reinforces what we talked about last week. Now, these next three techniques to make your lead generation more sustainable, let's dive into each one of these. So, number one, I'm sorry, we're on number three now, right? Pace yourself. You know that you're going to ramp up and down your lead generation with your capacity and goals. It cannot be equal all of the time. You cannot be in a sprint all of the time. You can't even be in kind of an active mode all of the time. Sometimes you want to just do the very bare minimum, and that's not a problem. When you know what the answer to this is enough, if I do this amount of lead generation over the course of the month, it will quote unquote be enough. Then that gives you so much more ability to ramp up and down based on your capacity. You might be traveling for a client for a given week. Let's be realistic. It's probably not realistic that you're going to, also do all out sprint that week, right? You want to marry up your capacity and your goals in a way that paces yourself. So, following on to that second topic that we talked about, which is having the routine is going to ramp up and down. So, you're going to pace yourself. And that's where you're choosing what I call a mode. And we have a whole episode on this. So, we'll link that in the show notes as well. But you want to be thinking about on a monthly basis, for example, what is the mode I want to be in on this for this particular month that I believe will match up to my goals. So, sprint, for example, that's where you're doing a burst of activity to fill your pipeline and create momentum. A sprint can be a great thing to do for a month or just for a week, even where you want to have that burst of activity and get yourself back into motion. That's why it's so valuable to do with a group of people so that, you're all in it together and thriving from that group momentum and energy as well. But you can certainly do it on your own too. And then we have active mode. This is where you're gearing up to fill capacity and you're doing more of the activity than from your formula, but not to the sprint level. And then finally, the lowest level of activity is your run maintain. You knowing clearly based on your formula what the bare minimum activities are that you want to execute to generate awareness, build relationships, keep relationships fresh, and stay top of mind. Knowing what that bare minimum is also helps you so much so that you, again, are not worrying about, am I doing enough? Am I doing too much? It's like, no, I know exactly what I need to do on a bare minimum basis, on a bare minimum weekly basis, on a bare minimum monthly basis to hit my goals, especially if I'm going to implement an active mode during the course of a quarter and the sprint mode, at some point during the course of a quarter. So you're able to ramp up and down. You're able to have kind of a scale of activity versus feeling like if you're not going all out, that it's not enough. And therefore, it doesn't become mentally sustainable for you, right? So defining those really clearly for yourself. What is my bare minimum? Answering that. What is active where I'm not in a full out sprint, but it's more than run maintain. So it's that middle level. And then what does a sprint look like? So you know exactly what those look like. You don't have to decide every time you're planning out your quarter and your month and your week. You don't need to decide. You can go back to your plan and say, okay, this is what it looks like. And this is the mode I'm choosing for this week based on all those other variables of, other things you've got going on and what you need the pipeline results to look like. And then you implement that mode. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about a few weeks ago of not having to make so many decisions all of the time. You can decide at the end of this year as you're planning for next year, you just decide what do those three modes look like? And then you'll be able to just pick and choose. You don't have to decide every single week, what am I going to do for lead generation? Right. And then you're implementing that mode and then you're adjusting and evaluating based on your learnings. You're evaluating and adjusting in that order based on your learnings. Right. The thing I want to point out to you though, is that it's important to notice there's no zero mode or do it later mode. There's no mode of I'm going to ignore lead generation this week or this month. That's not a mode. So being really clear with yourself about what mode are you in and what do those mean will make it so much more sustainable for you because you are able to keep the logistics really easy for yourself and also the mental side of this managed more effectively as well so that you're not taking up those cycles with all of these unanswered questions going on in your mind and second guessing going on in your mind. Okay, so that was the third piece of this, right? Just to reiterate, the first piece was that you have a formula that or gives you your best guess that's going to yield the expected results that you've committed to completing until you've got enough data points to know what you need to adjust. So that's number one. You've got that lead gen formula that you have committed to figuring out that it will the expected results that you're wanting. Number two, you've built out your routine. You know your schedule. You know when you're going to do your lead gen. Number three, you've got a method of pacing yourself so that you can ramp it up at that routine up and down with your weekly capacity and the goals of your pipeline. And you don't have to decide every single week, what are you going to do? You already know what the activities are. You're just choosing a mode. And then number four is making lead gen easier. making lead gen easier so that you do make the most of your time. You don't have to be pushing a boulder up the hill every week. You don't have to be reaching out to 100, cold leads, for example. You can make lead gen easier for yourself over time. Once you get this engine up and running and starting to dialing it in, you make lead gen easier for yourself by getting to the place where you're generating inbound leads. You make lead gen easier for yourself and therefore make the most of your time when you get to the place where you're generating inbound leads. And why they're so valuable is because they have a need. You're not trying to figure out what their need is and converting them into a prospect. They come to you as a prospect. Their need is likely time sensitive, that they need it, whatever they need it now, not in 2 years. And they're seeking you out as a solution. These are incredibly valuable. And so you want to be thinking about, to make lead generation sustainable over the long run, you want to be focusing in on putting a system in place that generates these inbound leads. And that comes from doing things like speaking, publishing thought leadership, building channel partnerships, creating collaborations with other consultants so that you can generate this inbound interest. So when you're thinking about making lead generation sustainable, you may need to be doing some techniques that create more immediate types of opportunities, but you also want to be focusing in on putting this kind of engine in place as well for yourself so that you're able to start generating inbound leads over time. That's ultimately a huge lever for you to make lead generation sustainable when you've got all the leads coming to you and you don't feel like you have to hustle to create leads when your pipeline is thin or empty. Okay. And then the fifth one is probably not a surprise to you, but it's managing your mental load. Again, because when we started out this episode, we were talking about the main source of a unsustainable lead gen process is because of your mind, right? I don't know if this is enough. I don't know if this is going to work. All of these thought processes that we have swirling around in our mind, right? It's racing often. Am I doing enough? Am I saying the right thing? Am I saying the wrong thing? Am I too salesy? Am I not salesy enough? Why aren't they responding to my emails? Like, we just had a great meeting. How am I going to fit everything in? How am I going to keep this up? All of those swirling thoughts, whether you're noticing them actively or they're just happening under the cover subconsciously, this is one of the biggest causes of your lead gen process not being sustainable. It's like an endless stream of questions, and the inner critic is so brutal and it wears you down. It wears you down. It wears all of us down when this is happening. And so, in addition to those four other methods that we talked through, this fifth one is so important. And for so many consultants, it's something they don't have in place or they're not consistently operating or prioritizing. In the lead gen sprint, I taught the people in the sprint the concept of a thought plan. And we worked through putting this in place to help them to be more effective with having conversations with their potential clients and people they're meeting, and also to keep this mental load managed. And so I'll share a little bit of it with you today here, which is you having a practice that helps you manage your mind is the key to your overall lead gen plan and making it sustainable. And that effective mind management approach involves awareness, you knowing what you're thinking and why you're thinking it. For so many of us, we think that question, am I doing enough? Is this enough? We just think it's kind of like an innocent question, right? It's not an innocent question. It's not a valid question. Am I doing enough? Because that creates an open loop in your mind that creates this heavy mental load for you. So rather than just letting that question kind of go unmanaged, you want to know it's there as an example and then put a process in place to redirect it so that you're saying to yourself, in this example, if your mind is racing, this won't be enough, I'm not doing enough, all of those questions about enough, you notice it and then you take hold of it and say, listen, I've decided that for the next quarter that X activity that I believe will create Y result is enough, is plenty. It's possible this will be enough. So you're redirecting your mind back to a place of focus versus letting this unmanaged open cycle take hold. It's like we've talked about this movie on these episodes before, but I'll say it again. You know, the Inside Out movie where there's all these different characters at the helm in this teenager's brain. We cannot let anxiety run the show. We cannot let self-doubt run the show. It's so chaotic and exhausting. So that's where you want a practice to manage your mind as a business owner, to number one, be aware of what are the thought processes that are creating an unsustainable situation in your mind, and redirecting those, being aware of them, redirecting them purposefully and repetitively until you build a new way of thinking. I used to think these things all the time, questioning all the time. Is this going to work? Will I be able to contribute financially to our family at the same level I did in corporate? Will I be able to keep this up? There's so many balls I have to juggle. All of those kinds of questions are not valuable. It wasn't until I figured out for myself how to manage all of those questions. Number one, to know they were there and that they were not just valid questions. They were questions just keeping me stuck in the status quo. Then number two, figuring out new ways to redirect them, to ask for myself rather, higher quality questions. The question, am I doing enough, is not a high quality question. Changing that to, I've created this hypothesis. In what 2 or 3 ways can I measure whether it's enough? That's a high quality question, right? So it's that awareness, it's the redirection, and it's the repetition until your brain just gives up on that method of keeping you in the status quo and moves on to another one. It'll always move on to another one, right? But you want to be managing your mind and having a practice to manage your mind, because ultimately, regardless of all the other strategies I just shared with you on this episode, this one is the one that is going to make it sustainable for you. Because when you let your mind go off on its own and wander off onto all these second guessing and self doubt and lack of confidence, then ultimately that won't be sustainable for you. It's so draining. So you want to get yourself to the place where you've got a practice of managing your mind. Okay, I hit this one hard because it's so important. All right, let's wrap up today's episode by talking about how to put it into action. So, number one, you want to implement those 5 strategies that we covered in today's episode. To repeat what they are, and we'll put the list of them in the show notes as well. But number one, you want to know what your lead gen formula is so that you've got a way to measure whether or not what you're doing for lead generation is yielding the expected results, and you don't have that open loop of what's enough. Number 2, you want to have a routine. So it's on your schedule. You know what you're doing and when you're doing it, and not waiting until you've got leftover time or extra time or a less busy week to focus on lead generation, that it's something that you're always focused on. Number 3, even though you're always focused on it, it's ramping up and down, right? You've got a method and a predefined method of what it looks like to ramp up and down, whether it's run, maintain mode, active mode, or sprint mode, not zero mode, to get you where you want to be. Then number 4, you putting those activities in place to generate inbound leads. So this whole thing can be less taxing on you over time, where you've got the leads coming in to you that are high quality. And then number 4, you've got a practice to manage the mental load. So those are the 5 strategies to put today's episode into action. I would start with the mental one first and then work on the other 4 as you go. And then also to remind you, go take that consultant's lead gen effectiveness assessment. It's at pipelinescorecard.com. And then join the waitlist to get help for this. I know for sure I did this for so long and said, oh, I can do this on my own. I'll do my own sprint. And I never do. I've always got so many other things to focus in on. That's why I'm always in some form of a coaching relationship, where it's a program or a coach, one-on-one coach, or both. Get help. It helps you to purposefully and intentionally create that focus for yourself every single week so you can put these building blocks in place. So you can go join the waitlist at consultantsprint.com, and I will see you again next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melissalieberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.